Good evening, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here to deliver the annual James Connolly Lecture, and I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me to deliver this lecture. As a long-time union organiser and now leader of Scotland's trade union movement, I'm really grateful to be given the opportunity to speak at this event, which honours James Connolly, an outstanding Scottish union organiser who ultimately gave his life for his beliefs and actions to support his class and deliver real change in Ireland. Today, I'd like to talk to you about the need for us to build a strong trade union movement to address the attacks on workers' rights and the practical steps that our governments, and indeed governments across the globe, need to be taking to deliver a genuine people's recovery in response to the pandemic, by rebuilding our economies so that they work for all of the people, not just the political powerful or the billionaire bosses. Now, it won't surprise you that this lecture will focus on addressing the deep-seated problems and also some of the constitutional issues facing Scotland in particular. But the actions required in Scotland, I hope, will resonate with many of you across a wide variety of nations. And ultimately, I think there's great strength to be gained from sharing our lived experiences and reaching out to build and mobilise our movements across borders and around shared goals. In 2019, before the global pandemic got started, Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, delivered a TED talk in Edinburgh. And the topic she addressed was about the need for economies to be measured by the health and happiness of their population and not just growth or GDP. Sturgeon argued that it was time for the world to adopt the concept of the well-being economy. And she stated that just as Adam Smith and his contemporaries in Scotland shaped the birth of modern economics over 200 years ago, so Scotland could lead the way now by joining with other governments to set up the WellBeing Economy Government Group, along with Iceland and New Zealand, and more recently, they've been joined by Finland. At its heart, she said this well-being economy would be about delivering a just transition for workers to meet the challenges of automation and climate change. It would be about challenging poverty and inequalities, promoting inclusion, and delivering fairer, well-paid employment, decent housing and access to greener, pollution-free communities. Now, these are all laudable, bold ambitions, and there's no doubting that this is a socially progressive approach for Scotland's economy. And it's a vision that the trade union movement in Scotland fully welcomes and supports. But as anyone who's ever tried to implement real, meaningful change knows, talking about vision and aspirations is the easy part of the process. Far harder is to take a long look at the reality of where we currently sit and to implement effective, lasting interventions, ones that will deliver systematic changes to how our economy operates that working people so desperately need. So what trade unions are saying to the First Minister of Scotland is this: the time has come to turn your talk into actions. Because the reality is that our economy isn't working and it's not serving the people's needs. We face the biggest economic crisis in living memory, and while the immediate cause might have been COVID-19, this virus has drawn its strength from generations of injustices. Coronavirus doesn't discriminate on the lines of class, but its effects are clearly exacerbated by imbalances in income, wealth, and power. So while we're all riding the same storm, we are most certainly not all doing so in the same boat. Scotland has high poverty levels. Prior to the pandemic, 1 in 5 Scots, over 1 million people, were living in poverty, and over half of those had a working adult in their household. So that's clear evidence that Scotland's poverty levels are increasingly driven by in-work poverty due to a prevalence of low-wage, insecure jobs. Mass privatisations, short-term investment, and the dominance of multinationals have all placed workers in a position of weakness, exacerbated by attacks on unions. This has led to the growth of precarious work through bogus self-employment, zero-hours contracts, and unwanted part-time working. And nearly 50 years after the Pay Act, the gender pay gap remains, where workplace injustice is a daily fact for BAME and disabled workers, and both groups have suffered disproportionately from this crisis. Almost half of all lower income households in Scotland live in what are classed as unfit dwellings. Dundee and Glasgow have the highest levels of fuel poverty in Europe, and Scotland has the highest drug deaths in Europe. The reality is that hundreds of thousands of Scottish workers are faced daily with a toxic mix of low wages, insecure contracts, rising fuel and food costs, high rents, and poor housing. Alongside this, the level of social security is an absolute disgrace. We seem to have lost the ability as a society to guarantee even basic rights, such as good quality affordable housing, a living income for the sick or unemployed, and a dignified care system for young and old alike. And having the worst statutory sick pay in the developed world is a shameful indictment on our Westminster government, given that our UK economy is one of the richest in the world. So we don't have a shortage of wealth in our economy. What we have is a fundamental issue with how that wealth is being shared. And this has led to Scotland's two richest families now having as much wealth as the poorest 20% of our whole population. And that wealth gap continues to grow. Although the real economy has contracted during the pandemic, house prices have surged. The primary winners of this have been existing homeowners, as well as private developers and estate agents. This surge in asset value, coupled with the stagnation of wages, further exacerbates the crisis of financialised capitalism, with wages continuing to fall as a proportion of GDP. Online retail sales have also surged during the pandemic, and among the largest beneficiaries of this shift have been huge internationally owned online retailers like Amazon and major UK supermarkets. And of course, those who've done very well indeed include the world's 10 richest men. Among them, Amazon's Jeff Bezos, Tesla founder Elon Musk, Microsoft's Bill Gates, and Facebook's CEO Mark Zuckerberg, who saw their net worth increase by $540 billion over the past year. But we know the people that have kept our society going aren't the billionaires. They're the cleaners, the carers, the nurses, the supermarket workers, cleansing workers, delivery workers, and many, many more. They're low paid, predominantly women, frontline key workers who've risked their own health and that of their families to keep us all safe. Our action and pay research shows that there's almost 1 million key workers in Scotland, with a third paid under £10 an hour, 2/3 are women, and almost half of all are employed in the public sector. The death rate for these workers has been 40% higher than the average death rate for workers during the pandemic, and yet most haven't seen a decent pay increase. And that's why when we trade unionists talk about recovery, we don't mean reverting to 2019, because how it was before wasn't good enough. We mean recovering for working class people the income, wealth, and sense of collective purpose stolen from us by decades of political bias towards the rich and powerful. This is where we take issue with the response so far from governments, because for all the welcome rhetoric of the well-being economy, levelling up, building back better, increased government support, there is as yet no plan to abolish the built-up conditions that made this crisis so damaging to so many in the first place. The fact is that neither the Scottish Government nor any others will be able to deliver on their warm aspirations to create a well-being economy without fundamental state intervention to reset the rules of the game and deliver a more level playing field for workers. Of course, we need more high earners paying taxes in our country and more high quality jobs. Of course, we need to support the entrepreneurs and the innovators in business to succeed in the delivery of new, greener industries. And we need to increase investment in these new areas from both the public purse and incentivise increased private sector investment from the huge profits that they're making. But the private sector alone is not going to create the level of transformation in our economy that the vast majority of people can benefit from. And it's time for all governments to acknowledge that trickle-down economics is failing our people. Market forces won't meet the challenges we face with increasing automation, the transition to a green economy, tackling endemic low pay and precarity that exist across key sectors, and rebuilding sustainable, high-quality jobs post-COVID. Because for that, we need big, bold, interventionist government policies. So with the private sector showing itself inadequate, there is no prospect of a green recovery without massive public sector intervention. And as we move towards COP26 in Glasgow, we must ensure that our global leaders recognise the need for this shift. But this public sector intervention must come with set conditions. In return for financial support, employers should be expected to provide fair work and recognise trade unions. And in areas such as healthcare, education, energy and housing, we need to rebuild public services and democratic public ownership. So ahead of Scotland's 2021 elections earlier this year, the STUC launched a report calling our government to action. We called for a people's recovery, for a different track for Scotland's economy. And our demands combined short-term measures to rebuild our economy with medium and longer-term measures to create a democratic and green economy and a society in which workers and their families have fair work, decent housing and a proper safety net. We called for a fundamental rethink on the purposes of growth and the introduction of a number of urgent measures that, if implemented, would deliver the sort of economic transformation required to support greater economic justice for all. The report received support from both the Scottish Labour Party and the Greens. It was welcomed by leading figures in the SNP, and it's formed the basis of our discussions with both Scottish Government and UK Government ministers on economic matters. Recently, the STUC has also been invited to sit on the Scottish Government's Advisory Council for Economic Transformation, which is charged with setting a 10-year strategy for transforming Scotland's economy. And on that group, we'll be arguing strongly for a radical approach to be adopted, which is based on the key actions laid out in our People's Recovery Report. But before getting into the specifics of the actions required, I'd like to point out that not all of these are within the current powers of the Scottish Government to deliver. Many of them still rest within the jurisdiction of the UK Westminster Government. However, given the Scottish Government's recent democratic mandate and stated intention to hold another independence referendum within the life of this current Parliament, it will be important for us to establish to what degree the constitutional proposals on offer will be able to meet our demands for a people's recovery. Indeed, it's likely that this will be the key question asked by trade unionists in Scotland in determining our position in the run-up to any further independence referendum. We also believe that a future referendum need not necessarily be reduced to a simple binary choice, but that the option of further devolution of a range of key powers also merits consideration. And we're also mindful of the lessons from Brexit. This time, we want to know exactly what is meant by the question on the ballot before the referendum takes place. If the people of Scotland had voted yes in 2014 to independence, then it's likely the breakup would have been at least as messy and complex as the Brexit negotiations turned out to be. And I know that I don't have to tell people here about the tremendous and complex difficulties that could arise if we're unclear about exactly what the form of independence on offer would enable Scotland to do, what fiscal and monetary powers Scotland would actually have, what the timescale and the immediate economic and budgetary impacts would be, and how independence would actually be achieved ahead of any vote. So for the moment, our jury's out on whether or not we would support a yes vote, but we are fully committed to supporting the Scottish people's right to self-determination and believe that any decision on a future referendum being triggered should be made by the Scottish Parliament and not in Westminster. And we continue to support a wide range of powers that currently rest with Westminster being devolved to the Scottish Parliament, because we believe that within these powers lie important and essential levers for delivering economic transformation in Scotland. As James Connolly said in one of his most famous quotes on Ireland, if you remove the English army tomorrow and hoist the green flag over Dublin Castle, unless you set about the organisation of the Socialist Republic, your efforts will be in vain. England will still rule you. She would rule you through her capitalists, through her landlords, through her financiers, through the whole array of commercial and individualist institutions she has planted in this country. Now, those words were said over 100 years ago, and in today's world, the most dominant imperialist is global capitalism itself. But these are still wise sentiments, well worth remembering for all considering the issue of Scottish independence right now, because neither the Growth Commission version of independence offered the last time by the SNP, nor the current status quo offered by the Tory-led Westminster government will deliver real change or a fairer share of the wealth for Scotland's workers. For that, we need to secure a very different approach to rebuilding Scotland's economy, and that remains our priority at this time. Now, with all that said, I want to return to focusing on the specific actions we think are necessary for delivering a people's recovery. The first priority is developing and delivering on industrial democracy and fair work. The Scottish Government has said they want to become a fair work world leader by 2025. But yet again, not enough action has been taken to make that aspiration a reality. The pandemic has already radically altered work patterns, so the guiding principle should be to give workers greater control of their own labour and their own data. Central to this must be industrial democracy and a fairer distribution of the costs and benefits of work. Trade union recognition and collective bargaining is a proven method for tackling in-work poverty, and that needs to be supported by our governments. So going forward, we're calling for regulation of home working so it becomes a system of greater freedom rather than one of employer control, cost-cutting and surveillance. Devolution of employment law so that we remove curbs on trade union freedom and give right of access to unions to all workplaces, strengthen employment rights and make them legally enforceable from day one in order to end precarious work. We're calling for the implementation of a policy to significantly raise pay levels and wipe out poverty pay for frontline public service workers, and raise the national minimum wage to over £10 an hour. We also want to introduce sectoral collective bargaining agreements in low-paid sectors like childcare, social care, hospitality and tourism, because strategies to eliminate poverty must address the workplace conditions that produce low pay. We want to see a rollout of the 4-day week with no loss of pay so that rising productivity enables full employment and greater leisure time. This could be introduced across the public sector to begin with, giving us more resilience across our workforce to cope with any future crisis, and grants could be given to pilot, support and roll out this approach across the private sector. And we are calling that government support is only provided, whether that be through procurement, contracting, commissioning, licensing, subsidies and grants, but that support is only provided to employers that recognise unions and apply union negotiated rates of pay. This is an important point because this is leverage that the Scottish Government can deploy now within their current powers. A £13 billion procurement and contracting budget represents powerful leverage on employers that's not yet being fully used. And we need to establish regional and sectoral forums to provide economic information to workers, trade unions and citizens to aid them to organise workers and engage in local economic development in their areas. And the next key area we need to look at is delivering a green recovery and a just transition for workers. The trade union movement has been quite successful in arguing that it's neither morally just or practically possible to achieve our low carbon emissions targets if those reductions are at the expense of workers and communities. But nonetheless, in Scotland and across much of the world, a just transition to a low carbon economy remains a slogan rather than a reality. Markets, corporate advertising and individual behaviour change are no means to achieve either social or environmental justice. The Scottish Government has adopted the language of a Green New Deal, but not the reality of it, as it promotes market-ready projects by offering strong commercial returns to private capital. A just green future can only be built on public investment, democratic ownership and a strong domestic supply chain, beginning with energy and transport. So what we're calling for is an emergency green infrastructure stimulus package to support Scotland's economic recovery, including a comprehensive house building and deep retrofit programme to drastically reduce building emissions and tackle fuel poverty, with substantial support for public transport too, while usage recovers. And we want to see government invest in local authority-led public works programmes and apprenticeships to provide meaningful employment opportunities to support and upskill young workers in new jobs. We also want to see a requirement introduced for local content in all green energy leases and planning consents. This will shorten supply chains and provide manufacturing jobs here in Scotland. And we need to establish a publicly owned energy company and publicly owned construction and infrastructure companies to drive forward green energy development and strategic infrastructure while supporting high quality, sustainable employment. The next area we're focused on is the need for democratic public ownership and community wealth building. Decades of political dogma have established the principle of private good, public bad. Yet the banking and coronavirus crisis have both illustrated that businesses are substantially dependent on public investment. Too often, though, state intervention has involved bailouts for shareholders paid for by cuts to public services. But public ownership can have a positive entrepreneurial role. For example, most high-tech innovative products rarely emerge without massive public subsidy. There's been welcome moves to public ownership in Scotland, but these remain small scale and still focused on bailing out failing enterprises. We need to shift this approach from reactive to proactive with a planned industrial strategy to address climate change and unemployment that would involve developing profit-making enterprises. This could help address the decline of regional town centres and ensure wealth doesn't flow out of our communities but circulates within them. So we want to see government draw on the concept of community wealth building by providing greater powers and funding to local government to insource local services and address issues of corporate control by adopting new forms of community and democratic public ownership. And we want to create a Scotland-wide high street task force to regenerate towns, protect jobs and improve shared community space. Now we know that all this has to be paid for, and that's where we turn our demands towards public finance and investment. Public services have been neglected, regional economies have declined, and firms have put short-term profits over research and development for far too long, and this has damaged our economy. These problems were actually evident even before 2008, but austerity made matters much worse, leaving a severely damaged and divided society. But in the face of the pandemic, traditional limits on public spending and investment have been abandoned. Superficially, the political consensus has moved towards job guarantees, infrastructure projects, and support schemes for businesses. However, to shift this further towards rebuilding a fairer society, we need to rebuild and rebalance through tax, introducing wealth taxes on the corporate giants and progressive income taxes to address economic inequality. We need to rebuild our borrowing capacity. We want the UK government to devolve borrowing powers to the Scottish Parliament to allow it to pursue its own expansionary economic policies and restructure our economy. And we need to rebuild investment and enable the Scottish National Investment Bank to invest in a more socially just, resilient and low carbon economy via state-holding companies and municipal enterprises, and not just through offering private sector support. And we need to reverse the cuts in local authority funding and offer a debt amnesty for Scottish councils as part of a wide package of measures aimed at easing the acute financial crisis facing Scotland's local authorities. And then I come to tackling inequalities and supporting disadvantaged groups, which is another key area for our people's recovery. The effects of coronavirus have had a disproportionate impact against certain groups, be they BAME people, women, disabled workers, the young, or those from our LGBT plus communities. All this means we need to devolve equality law and ensure a day one right to flexible working for all workers, take action to reduce the disability employment pay gap and the race and gender pay gaps, and this will be aided by us introducing the sectoral bargaining arrangements in sectors such as care and hospitality, where women and BAME women are actually overrepresented. And we need to ensure that 10% of all apprenticeships go to disabled workers and ensure proportionate numbers of women and Black and minority ethnic people access job guarantee schemes. We need to rebuild equality in our pay. It's time to conduct a new equal pay audit across all parts of the public sector in Scotland to resolve all outstanding equal pay claims. And turning to social security and housing, we've been subjected to damaging welfare reforms over decades. The sick, unemployed and vulnerable have been effectively criminalised and forced into society's margins, subsiding on meagre benefits and faced with arduous and humiliating means tests. Social housing has been transformed by deliberate government policy from a normal fact of everyday life into an emergency system for isolating the extremely poor and vulnerable. Responsibilities have been passed down to private individuals and private firms, and the results are growing homelessness, exorbitant private rents, and a generation of young people forced to live with parents into their 30s. So to combat this, we need to provide a minimum income guarantee for all, raise the weekly level of statutory sick pay to £320 a week and remove the lower earnings limit, end benefits sanctions and the benefits cap, replace the work capability assessment with NHS medical assessments, and end the DWP's target-based culture and the outsourcing of contracts to the private sector. We need to enshrine in law a right to access healthy, affordable and nutritious food and properly fund our public services to do this. We need to provide opportunities for young people and those out of work paid at the real living wage or the union bargained rate for the job by augmenting the job guarantee schemes with local authority-led public works programmes. We need to massively expand the supply of publicly owned housing through municipal house building and protect private renters with rent controls. And finally, to support any kind of wellbeing economy, we need universal public services. Austerity has left our public sector poorly equipped to plan for and deal with emergencies. During the pandemic, we saw the systems for supplying and distributing PPE and virus testing were found seriously wanting. Our NHS was at the brink. Our care system and vital local services were decimated and had very little resilience. And for those facing a sudden loss of income, a lack of social security advisors meant lengthy waits to access social security support. We've got to learn those lessons. And to do that, we need to end outsourcing across our public services and properly fund health, education, emergency services, and central and local government, recognising their essential role in supporting a wellbeing economy. We need to create a national care service, rooting out for-profit care provision and levelling up terms and conditions through collective bargaining. We need to commit to publicly funded early learning and childcare, value our teachers by reducing their stress and overworking, support our universities and colleges with a package which enhances democratic accountability and fair work practices. And the time is definitely overdue to recognise, as Labour did in its 2019 manifesto, that broadband is a vital public service which should be delivered free and across every part of the UK to our whole population. So in conclusion, what I would say about these demands is that although they are comprehensive and wide-ranging, touching all aspects of the economy, in our view, they are also modest, pragmatic, and eminently achievable. Given the wealth in our economy, it all comes down to whether the political will exists to execute these measures. We're not calling here for a revolution, but we are demanding radical change and a fairer share of the wealth. So right now, trade unionists have an important opportunity because across the world, governments are realising that their attachment to neoliberal market-led ideology is outdated and it's just not up to meeting the real challenges we're facing today, like the pandemic and climate change. Across the world, this pandemic has taught hard lessons about the need for a resilient economy with strong, well-resourced public services and the need to look after your population's health and welfare and invest in their skills. But that alone is not enough. We can't leave it to the politicians to implement our demands for economic transformation and a fairer share of the wealth for all our citizens, because the ruling classes won't give up their gains without a fight. So we need to build strong trade unions, and the trade unions need to build a mass movement for change, and we need to fight for that change. There are no magic wands and no shortcuts to building our movement and mobilising the population behind our demands. It all comes back to educating, agitating and organising, street by street and workplace by workplace. That means we need union leaders at every level of our structures who are serious about putting more organising resources on the ground and serious about building strong collective fighting back trade unionism. In the face of this pandemic, people are waking up to the injustices in our economy. They're questioning why it's those who do the most valuable work and face the highest risks who are also suffering from chronic low pay in our society. They've seen the bad work kills and that we need decent public services. And it's up to us to capture this moment and harness the anger that people are feeling with hope and with action. Individuals can have on paper all the rights they want, but they're often not empowered to access those rights from their employer unless they exercise their power as part of a collective in a trade union. Similarly, people feel that as individuals, they have no power over governments and politicians. So we need to build that collective people power and build the anger and the momentum that will move politicians and governments to act in our interests. Right now is the key moment for us to unite as a class, to mobilise our people and to get everyone behind our demands for a genuine people's recovery. No real change has ever been achieved in favour of ordinary people without huge collective struggle. So coming out of this global pandemic and the economic crisis it's created, we, the working class, don't just have to weather the storm. We need to be the storm. Thank you.